And my final guest is Ramesh Sepehrrad, an Iranian-American author and scholar, here to talk about the Iranian protests and broader movement against the Iranian regime and the push for democracy. Ramesh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my goodness, it's my pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, so just to start off with, last September, 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini died after spending 3 days in a coma in custody. She was arrested by the country's, Iran's mortality police, who accused her of being in violation of a law that requires women to wear a hijab. It looked like she was severely beaten, and it looks quite suspicious, obviously. We saw protests beginning at her funeral, and it's turned into such a global movement. This isn't the first time we've seen protests and demonstrations from Iran, reach outside of the country's borders. But talk about how this has really exploded into a global movement in support of Iranian women.
Absolutely. Mahsa was the trigger. She was the trigger not just for the internal uprising that reached across all of Iran, but also a global movement. When it comes to that women life freedom, women in every home is waking up to that message, that point of awareness that we can no longer be silent when it comes to misogyny in power and what we see happening inside Iran. So from that perspective, I think Mahsa did her service for the movement, for freedom, for a non-nuclear secular republic in Iran. And I think the reason I say non-nuclear secular republic, because the message of Iranian women is not just for social freedoms, is not just for economic freedom, but it's also for political freedoms. And if you look at Iran's history, in fact, over the last 4 decades, women from all walks of life have been protesting. We just haven't heard about them. And now with the women life freedom, we see that the message is down with the dictators, down with the mullahs, be it the Shah, be it the despots of the past or the current regime, the despots of today. And women of Iran are essentially telling the world, stand with us as we want to change this regime and bring about a republic that really allows women to be free, whether they choose to put the hijab on or they choose to take it off. That would be based on their choice. So I think it's incredible to see the global movement in support of Iranian women. One thing I would add, Julia, is that the response from U.S. Congress has been tremendous when it comes to the support of Iranian women. And I'm talking both the House and the Senate. Just recently, the House Resolution 100 was passed by absolute majority, a very strong bipartisan support for the Iranian people and their uprising as they strive to have a non-nuclear secular republic in Iran, which really offers the administration a policy framework on how to move forward in supporting the people of Iran. And at the helm of it, at the center of it, is the voice of women. At the center of it is the 10-point plan by a female leader, Mayam Rajavi, who has offered what does it look like when this regime is gone, when we could have a secular Iran, when we could have a modern judicial system, free and fair elections, end of the executions, abolishment of the death penalty in Iran, peaceful coexistence with our neighbors, and as well as adherence to all Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of the international treaties, so that Iran can in fact come back to the international community in a more meaningful and in a more productive way versus what we see today in Iran.
Yeah, and it was 43 years ago on International Women's Day where the Iranian regime, after the revolution, really got its first taste of women in Iran pushing back against the restrictions that that they would face for the 40 years that followed. Talk about the role of Iranian women and pushing back against the regime. You had the revolution, obviously, in 1979, and then in 2009 there was the Green Revolution, and now we're in this, this period of protest. I mean, first of all, is this a revolution, and how are women at the head of it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the only answer I can give you is we have to look into the slogans that's coming from inside Iran. The slogans of the protesters is, don't call it a protest, it's a revolution. So, and it's a revolution on all fronts. It's a revolution to really uproot misogyny that's in power under the mullahs. If you look at Iran's constitution, they have brought such restriction on women's lives. And you talked about the very first March 8th International Women's Day in Iran, right after the revolution. And it was the Iran Iranian regime's thugs and those who attacked the women, and it was the progressive women, it was the various opposition groups at the time, the political groups that had some political freedom to express their platform for a free Iran. But the Iranian regime used religion as a weapon to consolidate its power in the first decade of the revolution. And if you look at the record of human rights violations in Iran, for example, in 1988, there was a massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran. Many of them are women from all ages. We're not just talking a certain age group. We're talking children as young as 13 years old, teenagers, all the way to grandmothers as old as 73 years old. So this is a regime that doesn't really think about women's right in just targeting a certain sector of the society. Is women, just because you're a woman, you have an enemy in this regime, and it's what we call a gender apartheid that they have established in the country. So once you look at it from that perspective, you understand why women have been willing to pay the ultimate price and be able to be standing up for their rights, whether they're facing torture or execution, and not backing down because they want freedom, not just for themselves, but for the Iranian society. And it's only natural that you see women have reached the leadership role in fighting this regime over the last 4 decades. You know, if you look at even the protests in the recent months, women and girls have been on the forefront of organizing these protests. There are resistance units that are formed inside Iran women are key element and key part of those resistance units. And again, at the end of the day, we believe women who are the agent for change are going to bring this regime down and establish a republic that would be serving the Iranian society, that would be free and democratic.
Unfortunately, over the past month, we've seen really horrific headlines out of Iran about poisonings, and these poisonings seem to be happening to young women who have connections to some of these protests, these demonstrations. What more do we know about these poisonings, and what is being done about this in Iran?
That's right. I think these poisonings, from the reports that I'm seeing and I'm receiving from inside Iran, are intentional. My own family member their children were targeted of these poisoning. But you have to remember, the young girls who were in the streets protesting over the last several months are actually the ones that are making this regime be frightened of them. And the regime is trying to use what's happening in Afghanistan and try to, what I call a copycat, target the young girls in Iran with their poisoning plots against these schools. At the end of the day, if this regime is in power and able to crack down the protests and arrest the protesters, why can't they find the people that are behind these poisoning of the schools? And everyone in Iran essentially says it's the regime that's behind these poisoning, and it's intentional, and they're trying to create a distraction for the Iranian society so that parents and their daughters are not going to the streets protesting. But what we see is the courage of Iranian women. Iran just celebrated a New Year's, the first day of March. But even in the first day of March, on our New Year's, you see protests still happening. And women are taking part in these protests. So regardless of what sort of plot, what sort of game the Iranian regime tries to play to demoralize the Iranian people, they're not going to be successful. The clock is not going back to before September. People are marching on until they bring this regime down and establish a democracy in Iran.
Those of us watching what's happening from the United States in the West, we're getting a very sort of altered view of what's happening. We know that there's some Western outlets that have been let into Iran, but it seems like they're being closely monitored by the regime. Final question, what's it like to be a woman in Iran right now?
I've been in this country for so many years, so I can't even pretend that I know these days what it's like to be a woman in Iran. But when I talk to them inside, when I talk to my family members, when I talk to my contacts inside Iran, what they're saying is, yes, we are under attack. We are under attack every day, whether it's in our private sphere or in public sphere by the regime. There's a state-sponsored misogyny and war on women that's going on in Iran. But they're not demoralized. They're inspired, they're motivated, they're organized, they're coordinating efforts, whether they are, mothers, daughters, wives, they're mobilizing their male partners, their brothers, their fathers, their sons to work together, because they know that their freedom depends on the revolution that is forthcoming in Iran. And they know that this is it. This is their moment. As I said, the change agent that we expect them to be, and they have a role model to follow. When you look at what Maryam Rajavi has done in the past 4 decades, meeting with parliamentarian members, meeting with members of Congress across Europe and US, laying out her platform for a future Iran, and really working on the issue of democracy and freedom in Iran day in and day out, that role model inspires the Iranian people and Iranian women in particular, and they know what it takes to bring this regime down.
Ramesh, thank you so much for carving out some of your time to come speak to us in person. Happy belated New Year, and woman, life, freedom, cannot say it enough.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our accomplished speakers and to all of you for watching. And for those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have a video from the event up on our website shortly. I'm Julia Manchester, and have a great rest of your day.